Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, my name is James Reaney. Welcome, and let me just check here. We're here for the James Reaney Memorial Lecture as part of Words Festival. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Give yourself a hand. This is fantastic. If the name James Reaney is new to you, and even if it's not, the best place to look for information is a website held by my sister out on Galliano Island in British Columbia, Susan Reaney. It's jamesreaney.com, jamesreaney.com. There is a companion website, callingthibodeau.com, callingthibodeau.com that I also recommend highly. I'm thrilled to have this year's lecture giver, speaker, friend, ally, with us, Stan Dragland, all the way from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Please welcome Stan. I'll keep my remarks brief. The lecture started at the Stratford Public Library. My late mother, Colleen Thibodeau, gave the first lecture. This is now the 10th. We were delighted. Carolyn is Carolyn, you, please stand up. You embraced us and encouraged us to come down to London. And then the Words Festival has embraced us since then, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Stan was a force in London and a friend and ally of my father, James Crerar. James Reaney from really the 1970s, and probably even and beyond, has done all kinds of incredible things. But it's his time to shine. Please welcome Stan Dragland. And thank you, Words Festival.
I'm very grateful to be here, but I'm not going to thank everybody in detail, so as not to take too much of my own time. I'm going to show you some images. Don't worry too much about, I'm not going to explain them as I go. It's kind of mix and match. I wanted you to see some images done by James Reaney himself and a few other things too. But there is a handout so if you want to catch it before you go, so you can see what you did see. And I've had to cut some of this, realizing we're kind of maybe tight for time. So I want to say one thing about what's gone, and that is just a bit of basic information about the Donnelly tragedy. Probably everybody knows about it here, but just in case. In February of 1880, 5 members of the family were murdered by their neighbors. And James Reaney has written a trilogy of plays on that subject. And if you read nothing else of James Reaney, do read that trilogy. Also, this being the 45th anniversary of Brick Books, and since I was in at the beginning, I want to show you a couple of images connected to that at the end. And then I'm told that Brick Books is here with a gift of a book for everybody in the audience. So there will be something to take away from this talk. In 1984, at an event called the Longliners Conference on the Canadian Long Poem, James Reaney had been listening. Better show you James Reaney first. James Reaney had been listening to various papers on the long poem and indulging in his habit of sketching while others talked. To the published proceedings, he contributed quick studies of other presenters. Some of the papers were based on what was called the absence of contemporary grids of meaning, sponsored by then current post-structuralist theory and embraced by certain postmodernist writers. A presentation by Roy Meeke, for example, cited Jacques Derrida on the disappearance of the so-called transcendental signifier, which had once held everything together. This was part of the orthodoxy of the time, but Reaney was never orthodox, and he wasn't having it. In his own talk, he says, there has to be something outside ourselves that inspires and orders. Reaney's presentation was so far out of the mainstream of skeptical thought being generally advanced at the time that he could actually call Alligator Pie Dennis Lee's most effective poem. Dennis Lee was listening, somewhat ruefully, I imagine. Since the praise promoted a collection of lyrics into a long poem and whizzed over Lee's adult poetry. I see Reaney properly in that company of long poem writers and theorists, but not of them, standing for a vision that some of the others will have considered old-fashioned. I become most interested in something he said in the discussion that followed his presentation. Asked where he stood on the matter of those so-called long-gone grids of meaning, he offered this take on Derrida. The way I read Derrida is different. What Derrida is doing is he wants a reaction. He doesn't want you to agree with him, surely. No one could agree with that. And everybody laughed when they heard Reaney say that. It's intended to arouse the old, whatever it is, the old Martin Luther or something, or Ezekiel or Isaiah, or those Old Testament prophet kinds of thing. Sure, the role is absolutely all illusion. Nothing means anything. It's just a fog. But by God, I'm not a fog. I see a living chariot with 4 wheels on it, all covered with eyes. How about that? Laughter followed that outburst, too. But Jamie was not joking. Suddenly he was Ezekiel. And I'm grateful to Tom Jerry's book on Reaney's emblem poems for reminding me that in this Reaney moment, Ezekiel would be joined by William Blake and Northrop Frye, who says, Blake's cosmology, of which the symbol is Ezekiel's vision of the chariot of God with its wheels within wheels, is a revolutionary vision of the universe transformed by the creative imagination into a human shape. This cosmology is not a vision of things as they are ordered, but of things as they could be ordered. The way Derrida works for me, Reaney went on as himself, is that I merely react, not necessarily in a positive, optimistic way, but with images and metaphors. And to hell with it. I don't care whether they're grids of meaning or not. I'm going to grid away. It makes me happy. His way was to draw material from the local in particular, to link it and so clarify it with archetypal patterns. He was with William Blake in wanting the New Jerusalem to be established not only in England's green and pleasant land, but in Canada, especially in Southwestern, the territory he knew best and loved most. The most exciting thing about this century, he says, launching his little magazine, Alphabet, is the number of poems that cannot be understood unless the reader quite reorganizes his way of looking at things, or rouses his faculties, as Blake would say. Finnegan's Wake and Dylan Thomas's Ultra-Wise by Owl Light. A sonnet sequence are good examples here. These works cannot be enjoyed to anywhere near their fullest unless one rouses one's heart, belly, and mind to grasp their secret alphabet, or iconography, or language of symbols and myths. A grasping such as is involved here leads to a more powerful inner life, or language of, or Blake's Jerusalem's Wall, besides which it's a hell of a lot of fun. It seems quite natural then, in this century, and particularly in this country, which could stand some more Jerusalem's Wall, that there should be a journal of some sort devoted to iconography. For Reaney, Jerusalem's Wall is a metaphor for a standing, permanent value, a standard of meaning, and an imaginative approach to making meaning. Reaney is not a biblical literalist. All of his work is pushing for as much New Jerusalem as can be established in this polite, prudish, provincial place. At least that's how Southwestern Canada looked to Reaney when he began writing. Here is a simpler way of putting what he was working towards, something he says in 14 Barrels from Sea to Sea, his book about the national tour of the Donnellys. I wonder if there's some special firewater you could feed to people in this country, just to get a more loving feeling started. What about grids? Grid is not Jamie's own word, of course. He picked it up from others at the Longliners Conference. And the literal meaning with all those right angles is not the best image for what he does. He'd be more likely to say pattern, or formula, or catalog, or paradigm, or list. Also backbone. I'll keep on with grid here, but really list is the better word. There is something about lists that hypnotizes me, Reaney says, introducing the catalog poems section of his book, Performance Poems. Now watch how he slides disparate things together in metaphor as he goes on. I think this fascination is connected with our joy in the rainbow's week of colors, in the 92-element candle you see in a physics lab at school, but then see all around you like a segmented serpent we're all tied together by. Our backbones with their xylophone vertebrae are such sentences, lists of symbolic objects in some sort of mysterious, overwhelming progression I have elsewhere called the backbones of whales. And indeed they are, for they are capable of becoming a paradigm, used as a secret structure. His play, Canada Canada is built on lists of various sorts. So is Colors in the Dark. In fact, lists or catalogs are everywhere in his work. As you can tell from listening to Reaney's turn as Ezekiel, and this is confirmed by reading through his work, the Bible was a rich source for him. His first writings, the poems of the Red Heart and the stories eventually collected up in the Box Social and other stories, were apostate. There was a time when he was writing in unfaith and troubled by what he has called the flood of bitter ink flowing from the divided boy long ago, the boy whose parents divorced and the family annexed an uncongenial stepfather. But he returned to the Bible as a source of archetypal stories and as a comprehensive pattern that stretches from Genesis to Revelation, Alpha to Omega, a grid, if you like, that answered a growing need in him for large containing pattern. Large pattern was also one of the things Reaney took from Northrop Frye. First from Fearful Symmetry, Frye's book on the poetry of William Blake, and then from the giant Anatomy of Criticism, a book that grew out of Frye's lectures on literary symbolism in a course that Reaney took in his U of T PhD program. Reaney was already a writer when he came under the influence of Frye, but he felt he had been flailing for want of sustaining grid and needed sustenance. There is huge and shapely pattern in Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. In his third essay, for example, Frye divides the types of literature into four modes: the mythos of spring, comedy; the mythos of summer, romance; the mythos of autumn, tragedy; the mythos of winter, irony or satire. These are not watertight compartments. They leak into one another, but they offer a grid into which any work of literature may be placed by those who wish to do so. This kind of synoptic mapping of the verbal universe was heartening to Reaney. In a sense, it underwrote everything he did from then on in. However, in looking at what he actually wrote, other than the essays, you would most likely not detect any literal adaptation, except maybe once in a loosely structured dramatic show called Southwestern. That's with an exclamation mark. This was presented in the university's drama workshop by student amateurs. One segment of that variety show whirligig was a clock drawn right out of Anatomy of Criticism. The minute hand was an actor who revolved with arm and finger, pointing by turns at 4 other actors at north, south, east, and west, each of them representing a fry mode and briefly displaying an action appropriate to the spirit of comedy, romance, tragedy, or irony. The tragedian stands out in my memory. Every time the dial struck him, he doubled over and screamed in pain. Round and round turned the wheel of modes in one of the most hilarious scenes I've ever witnessed in the theater. And I'm sure I would have found it, so even if I didn't know I was watching, in fast-forward capsule form, Archetypal Criticism, Theory of Myth, 3rd essay in Anatomy of Criticism. The 2 things arise from my thinking about Fry and Reaney. 1, I've sold my soul to Northrop Frye, Reaney said one time. Well, there was one genius employing hyperbole to pay homage to another. Of course, others have taken that kind of remark as an admission that Reaney was a derivative writer, one of the Phrygians, or small fry, as they were called, like J. Macpherson, another brilliant poet. Reaney calls these dismissive antagonists the anti-symbol, anti-anagogy gang. But I'm with Margaret Atwood on Reaney, the so-called Phrygian. Reading the publication of Reaney's collected poems, she says that most commentators, including Reaney himself, and his editor and critics, are somewhat off target about the much discussed influence of Fry on his work. I have long entertained a private vision of Fry reading through Reaney while muttering, "What have I wrought?" or "This is not what I meant at all." And this collection confirms it. The influence of Fry was probably a catalyst for Reaney rather than a new ingredient. Amen. Fry came up immediately when I thought to follow Reaney's gridding, and Fry does have to be mentioned, but no. The source of much of the gridding lies elsewhere. The sources and are myriad, complex, and often interlinked. Grids are everywhere, sometimes left as lists, to be later annotated or fleshed out, or to become the backbone or secret structure for a fully formed work. 2, defending the push for native drama and nationalism in general, Reaney says, I don't believe you can really be world or unprovincial or whatever until you've, well, there's Northrop Frye. I'm a little late with some of these things. I don't believe you can really be world or unprovincial or whatever until you've sunk your claws into a very locally colored tree trunk and scratched your way through to universality. That local tree trunk is not only Southwestern, it's also highly particular and detailed knowledge of fact and event drawn from widely scattered areas, set into tensile relationship and urged into motion to make what Reaney called a complex web of little and big sounds. The local particulars don't come out of Fry, neither does the poetry. As I read through the Donnelly trilogy again, one thing that stood out in very high relief was its many different oral registers. The sounds made both by props and by actors' voices, the latter including songs, poetry, animal sounds, Latin liturgy, formal or demotic speech of many sorts, English with Irish rhythms and diction, stage Irish, ignorant speech, elegant and witty speech, sophisticated rhetoric, salty language, creative cursing, a showman's spiel, narrative addressed to the audience, litanies of place names to carry a character from town to town, and dates, counting off dates, days of the week, months of the year, years of a life, compact expressions of passing time, passages from letters, inquest voices, choral speech and sound effect, newspaper headlines and period prose, items on bills, trial transcripts, legal language, etc., etc. Such a list, partial and dehydrated, may suggest the manyness of the technique, but it says nothing about what was seen as well as heard, nothing about how everything is economically layered together, myth and documentary, voices and bodies, humor and pathos, scene dissolving into tightly woven scene, all of it gorgeously designed. The list of humble props at the beginning of 14 Barrels from Sea to Sea is a page long. It's a marvel that despite the extraordinary complexity, the storyline is kept perfectly clear. I really hope people who don't know this story will go and read it, and if you ever can possibly do so, go see it. During the Winnipeg stand of the national tour, Reaney says he was excited to meet two separate families whose ancestors had come west from Banff Township in the 19th century. He had found references to those ancestors during his 7 years of Donnelly research. Now, meeting those families, he says, the verbal universe dissolves into human figures and faces, telling me things that enable me to go back into the patterns I am weaving in the world of words and adjust here, shade more there. Those shadings, some of them minute, set the Donnellys apart and to my mind, above all of other Reaney's drama. I don't sell that other drama short. In fact, the later comedy Gyroscope is one of my favorite Reaney plays. I merely register how very far Reaney has pushed all the levels of his art in creating his masterpiece. There's a self-portrait for you. Something else. In many of his other plays, antagonists are quite sharply defined, good guys and bad guys, so to speak. Stark black and whiteness fits the mythic patterns that Reaney so loves, but the Donnelly family is mixed. Mother and father and son will in their different ways, though not perfect or nevertheless memorably noble, part of the indomitable spirit of man in all ages, James Noonan calls them. But some of the other 6 boys are too energetic and wild for the good of the family's standing in the community. Men filled with verbs, Reaney calls them. And a couple of them he calls genuinely bad, and they make things worse. These plays incorporate some of the plot and character shadings of realism that Reaney was mostly inclined to disdain. We live in a fairy tale, not in real-life novels, he wrote in Southwestern Ontario. The brothers Grimm are right, Dreiser, Farrell, and Zola ain't. There's no need to agree with this to hear Reaney asserting a view and an aesthetic he often felt was undervalued and demeaned, but he was drawing on the nuancing value of realism. In the Donnellys, he needed it to delve into the story of what he has called a demonic atrocity, alive with all sorts of moral complexities that challenge one's capacity to really understand them. Okay, grids. First, poem 5 of an alphabet poem in Southwestern Ontario called Brushstrokes Decorating a Fan. A useful list: Hermes, Hera, Apollo, Zeus, Venus, Vulcan, Mars, Athena, Vesta, Hades, Poseidon, Ceres. Useful for what? Well, I don't quite know yet. but I swear that as an infant, born near the little lakes, I met them. Every morning in our house, Vesta used to light the stove. Vesta is the Roman goddess of fire at the hearth. Her name has appeared on Swan Vesta Strike Anywhere matches since 1906. Performance Poems has what Reaney calls a refugee from an unfinished suite of mine called Collegiate Olympus, in which the poet sees his high school teachers as the 12 Greek gods. None of my high school teachers would have figured as any god anywhere. And that's a whole question. Well, okay, let's not even go there. Also the grains, barley, buckwheat, oats, and wheat, ancient and curiously differing seeds, each of whose advents changed lives. Then there are the 6 senses, the parts of speech, the 12 signs of the zodiac with corresponding animals and parts of the body, the 27 words that one uses at home, the sun, the moon, and the 7 planets, Professor Sheldon's list of the various kinds of male body shapes photographed in his Atlas of Man, ectomorph, mesomorph, and endomorph with associated psychologies, the conjugation of a verb as backbone for a poem, like the one about Granny Crack in 12 Letters to a Small Town, One-Man Mask and Colors in the Dark, the 9 muses, the Furies, the Graces, the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, the days of the week, the 12 months of the year, also the indigenous 12 moons, the constellations, heraldic terms for a coat of arms, the 4 floors of a department store in a poem called Department Store Jesus, the 10 Commandments, which Reaney calls an alphabet, the phonetic symbols from Pike's phonemics arranged in a circle, the Ontario Tree Atlas, the Tarot Pack, the game of chess, Saints' Days of the Church, etc., etc. I won't read all of Wildflowers of Elgin County, one of my favorite list poems in Southwestern Home. Just the last few lines. Now, William Blake says that plants and trees, that, in other words, flora, are men and women seen from afar. So all these plant families are people, people you should know, and become more serene and thoughtful in doing so. I'm reminded of Sarah Milroy, writing about David Milne's watercolors of still water edges and trees, pictures that offer, she says, sanctuary for mankind's modern fall from grace. Sanctuary, like serenity, is a good word for what Reaney was after. It was something he found in the Pacific vision of David Wilson, leader of the Shaker-like sect called the Children of Peace. Alphabet 9 has an article by Ralph Cunningham about David Wilson, who had his Sharon Temple built to a symbolic grid. This is Cunningham. The temple's square plan symbolized the ideals of unity and justice. Wilson is supposed to have said that the square base signified that the children of peace meant to deal on the square with all men. The 3 stories represented the Trinity, the door in the center of each side, at the cardinal points of the compass, indicated that the people were to enter from every direction and on an equal footing. The equal number of windows in each side were to let the light of the gospel fall equally on all assembled. The lanterns at the corners of the 3 stories represented the 12 apostles. Inscribed with the word peace, the golden copper ball suspended among the topmost lanterns proclaimed peace to the world. Inside, the 12 columns forming a large square under the base of the 2nd story stood for the 12 apostles. The 4 columns forming a small square in the very center stood for faith, hope, love, and charity, the foundations on which the temple was built. Arches linking the 4 columns represented the rainbow. For one section of Canada-Canada. A play built on lists of Canadian things, humble and otherwise, as is another play, names and nicknames, Reaney draws on this information, adding a few things. The rainbow is Noah's, he says, and he mentions the 3,000 panes of glass that bring all the light in. Wilson and the sect attract me, he has said, because in an era of so much fundamentalist squalor of the spirit, we find a group which has that priceless gift, sensibility. They are like a serene hallucination in the pioneer history of Ontario. One way to approach all the Reaney grid work is to follow him championing traditional education programs against the so-called progressive education that infiltrated educational institutions at all levels during his time as artist and educator. In plays, essays, and poems, Reaney always comes down on the side of traditional discipline. Perhaps the underlying principle of all this lies in what Granny Delahaye says in Reaney's novel, Take the Big Picture. She enjoys being stretched by a story with some mystery to it. Things should be over people's head, she says, or how in Tophet are the heads going to get any higher? A Suit of Nettles, well, you should read A Suit of Nettles too, is a long poem beast fable about geese in a Southwestern farmyard. It's in 12 sections, one for each month of the year. It's also an extraordinarily sophisticated sampler of poetic forms, grid after grid after grid. Too much gridding to lay out here. All of it handled with a firm and gentle touch, some of it quite funny, some of it really poignant. The July section of A Suit of Nettles features an exchange between two geese. Answer, A-N-S-E-R, is current master of the Gosling School. He has the name of his genus, Grey Goose. Valancy is named after Isabella Valancy Crawford, one of Reaney's favorite early Canadian poets. Names usually tell you something in a Reaney poem or play. Remembering the very demanding curriculum of a previous Gosling generation, under a disciplinarian called Old Strictus, Valancy says, he taught us to know the most wonderful list of things. You could play games with it. Whenever you were bored or miserable, what he had taught you was like a marvelous deck of cards in your head that you could shuffle through and turn over into various combinations with endless delight. Well, 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 says Answer. Might I ask just what this reviving curriculum was? Valancy's response is a poem, a litany of grids. It brings us back to the New Jerusalem with details from the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Who are the children of the glacier and the earth? Esker and Hogsback, Drumlin and Came. What are the 4 elements and the 7 colors, the 10 forms of fire and the 12 tribes of Israel, the 8 winds and the 100 kinds of clouds, all of Jesse's stem and the various ranks of angels, the 9 worthies and the labor of Hercules, the sisters of Emily Bronte, the names of Milton's wives, the kings of England and Scotland with their queens, the names of all those hanged on the trees of law, since this province first cut up trees into gallows. What are the stones that support New Jerusalem's wall? Jasper and sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sard, sardius, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprasus, hyacinthine, and amethyst. About Valancy's program, really a tight version of Reaney's own, Answer exclaims, "My goodness, how useless, so far as the actual living of life is concerned. Why, we have simplicity itself compared to what that maze of obscurity was. I mean, since our heads are going to be chopped off anyhow, We only teach the young gosling what he likes. Now there's a defeatist attitude. There is a diminishing, disheartening dead end. I regret to say I feel it pulling at me in the Anthropocene era of climate crisis. And I cut a whole lot out of this spot here, which you probably are glad to hear I did.
Director's cut.
Yeah, see the long version on the website. The grids that Reaney finds to use for either content or form are drawn from disciplines widespread, some traditional and archetypal, some particular and local. He was always drawing on what he called the imaginative force which sees ways of making more meaning out of the world, finding the clue that joins up the different maze-like levels of our inner and outer worlds. The finding sometimes brings obscure or arcane knowledge into the reader or viewer's ken, information that thickens up the texture of a poem or play or essay, until the scope of the whole Reaney works comes to seem enormous. I'll just offer one more list. This one from Tattoo, an opera, a collaboration with John Beckwith, based on events surrounding the town of York, Upper Canada, now Toronto, 1780 to 1810, and featuring various military operations. Scene 3 is called How to Play the Drum. In it, a boy named Seth Harple, whose parents are Quakers, is undergoing instruction. When he masters his long roll, the drum major urges him on as follows. Well now then, today, now that we've learned the roll, the open flam, the 10-stroke roll, the close flam from hand to hand, the drag and stroke, let's try the 11-stroke roll. I never saw Tattoo, but I found even reading those words exciting. The discipline-specific terminology shows how Reaney's research hauls up specific grid information that is both instructive and dramatically potent. This particular research also helped with his play Wakusta, where a stage direction says, all the commands are given by different sequences of drum taps. The passage I just read comes from the outer world of percussion that is part of the soundscape of the opera. But the drumming, when mastered, is like other kinds of drumming in many cultures. When Seth knows his language, he can speak with it. I felt so close to our commander, he says. There were no written orders. We drummers and buglers were extensions of his mind. We were his voice, his thundering voice, commanding. This is the language of the inner world. Our inner ear, Jan Zwicky says, gives life to the music of the human mind. Now, it's important to note that Reaney never wants his gridding to serve anything rigid. Half the difficulties we're in, he says in 14 Barrels from Sea to Sea, come not from stupid people, but from clever ones who get tangled up in systems. There is the basis for most of his drama, right there. The conflict between loving, far-seeing characters who flex and those who exclude, demonize, persecute, and even murder those who don't fit into their systems. Everything and everyone around the Donnellys, Reaney says in his scholarly book, The Donnelly Documents, an Ontario Vendetta, were part of a closed society with a closed mythology where the individual meant nothing. It's the nonconformists that Reaney likes. People like you and I, men of the spirit, not the letter. People like Dr. Troyer in Baldoon, a man of vision, generosity, and love, as contrasted with John McTavish's Scottish Protestant grasping and emotional thrift. Baldoon features contrasting Protestantisms, one free and one oppressive. As the company enters from the back of the theater, goes the first stage direction, there should be a great feeling of bells, wind instruments, joy in God, the easy attainment of his light, joy in his creation. This should be a contrast with the more austere, bleak music of the Presbyterian psalm book, which we'll use at the beginning of Act 2. Here's the second verse of Simple Gifts, the Shaker hymn that opens Baldoon. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning we come round right. To bow and to bend. A version of this is sung in Sharon Temple. Oh, sorry about that quick one. It was a good one, too. To bow and to bend. A version of this is sung in Sharon Temple during a service of the Children of Peace in Reaney's libretto for Serenette, the opera, which was premiered in Sharon Temple. While lines of division are so distinctly drawn, a savior is absent and he's gone. Sharon Temple is a lantern of light and openness. The contrasting church in Serenette is St. James Cathedral in York, Upper Canada. Its windows so narrow and candles not allowed within that the choir can't even see to read their parts. Flexibility of thought and action is a defining feature of James and Judith and Will Donnelly. Tragically, it's also one thing that their idée fixe neighbors can't abide about them. Reaney's Donnellys don't take sides in local disputes. They are, according to their enemies, renegade be by themselves. Perhaps another way to put all this flex is to quote Reaney on the gyroscope, which lends the title to one of his best plays. Gyroscopes, he says, keep their balance under the most adverse conditions. If you keep spinning, that is, moving from where and what you are to the opposite of that, and then immediately to the opposite of that, then you have power, flexibility, love, energy, community, in short, balance, even in our absurd world where the real horizon is often obscured. By turning, we come round right. At its finest, Reaney's work is what he called an organism, a pulsating dance in and out of forms, with, I would add, theory fully subsumed. The place for theory in the finished work, says Barker Fairley, who made the portrait of Reaney that I showed you first, is that of the skylark who loses itself in the blue, heard but not seen, forgotten, yet flooding the air with melody. I'd say all this organic fluidity was already forming at least as far back as 1962, and is caught in the motto on Reaney's coat of arms for the Avon River in 12 letters to a small town. One of my earliest wishes, to flow like you. Let me move back into not sure where we are here, but never mind. Let me move back into the Donnelly trilogy through the subject of imprisoning grids. There is a literal grid in a scene early in Sticks and Stones, the first play of the trilogy, which involves a surveyor and the son he has along for company. Preceding the settlers in Biddulph Township, he lays his grid over the township, just as he and his like have gridded world topography. Boy asks father why the people who come to live on Concession 6, Lot 18, Biddulph Township, Middlesex County, Southwesto, why they will be fighting over that particular bit of ground. Well, the surveyor replies, to begin with, the way this lot is laid out. There's a small creek, enters it from the next farm, crosses it, and then flows into the next farm that is to be. It'll be the subject of a lawsuit, quarrels about water rights, flooding. They'll love that little creek. Boy, couldn't you stop that? Surveyor, well now, what would you suggest? Boy, make the farm a different shape? Surveyor, I'm not allowed to do that, Davy. The laws of geometry are the laws of geometry. No, we're a little too early there. Too early for that. The laws of geometry are the laws of geometry. No, people must make do with what right angles and Euclid and we surveyors and measurers provide for them. Well, the grid of geometry may be the most neutral source of the conflict that eventually overwhelms the Donnellys. The Catholic Church is at first either neutral or on the Donnelly side. At least the first priests at St. Patrick's Church, Lucan, see the Donnellys as fascinating people. Anything but the devils they are already beginning to be made out as, but this changes, partly because the bishop of a later era wishes to use his power to sway the Donnellys to vote Conservative, which they never do. The Catholic Church and the MacDonald government are in cahoots. So Father Connolly is sent to St. Patrick's. Connolly is a powerful man, but a man of extremes and little common sense. He visits every family in the parish shortly after his appointment. First the O'Hallorans, Donnelly enemies, and by superficial standards, the most respectable family in the parish. When he finally reaches a Donnelly household, he already has a fixed sense that they subscribe to none of the values he is supposed to represent. So his visit is confrontational. When Nora Donnelly, wife of Will, says to him, "There are always two sides to a story," his reply is chilling. "Well, Mrs. William Donnelly, in that supposition you are wrong. There is one side, mark this, and one side only." He already knows what side he's on. He will eventually hound the Donnellys out of his church. Equally chilling is the self-righteous bishop to whom Will Donnelly addresses himself in a letter, a cry for arbitration between himself and Father Connolly, since priest and parishioner had become rivals in the community. Early in the first play of the trilogy, the young Will is being tutored for confirmation by his mother. One of her questions, "Would you know how to address the bishop with the proper form of his title?" goes unanswered. That lapse comes back to haunt in Handcuffs, the third play. Here, after reading Will's letter asking him to do something before it is too late, the bishop first has two positive comments. "What beautiful handwriting," he says, "and the man should have been a priest." "But no," he concludes, "I am not your reverence, William Donnelly. I am your excellency." And he doesn't know that before you can stand, you must learn to kneel. In his ivory tower, high above and remote from the lives of the people whose shepherd he is supposed to be, the bishop has no way of knowing that Donnellys do not kneel. And he has no clue that they are too smart to be taken in by his clumsy strategy to sway them to the Conservative side. They are proud, independent, democratic people. They do not submit to those whose vision of things is less complex and tolerant than their own, not even when compromise would smooth their way in life. One fascinating thing about the shaping of the Donnelly trilogy is that there is never any doubt about the fate of the family. The murder is first spoken of by Mr. Donnelly early in Act 1 of Sticks and Stones, and is referred to again and again throughout the trilogy. Let me skip a little bit here. The massacre of the Donnellys is never staged, not directly. It need be represented by nothing more than violent sounds and shadows, because direct narration tells what is happening. And how it is that the victims go clear of the savage brutality of their murders is made clear in the poetic last words of Bridget, the niece whose visit from Ireland was so very poorly timed. She has fled the slaughter going on below. "When I got upstairs," she says, "I went to the window and knelt by it, hoping to see a star, if the one cloud that covered the whole sky would lift. I knew they would come to get me, and they did. They dragged me down the stairs. The star came closer as they beat me with the flail that unhusks your soul. At last I could see the star close by. It was my aunt and uncle's burning house in Ontario where, and in that house, James and Judith and Tom and Bridget Donnelly may be seen walking as in a fiery furnace, calmly and happily free at last. Donnellys may have company in that fiery furnace, just as in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are joined by one other who was not thrust into the furnace by Nebuchadnezzar. The three are walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. The fiery furnace speech is a beautiful and moving epitome of what Reaney has been reaching for just about all his writing life, reaching for it and trying to spread it. The intelligence of loving spirit that is deepest and best of all the tangle that makes us human. He found that spirit among other sources in the Bible, which promises a life beyond death. So what about The Dance of Death in London, Ontario? A book of poems based on the medieval Danse Macabre and illustrated with pointillist drawings by fellow London artist Jack Chambers. In the illustration, you can clearly see Reaney, poet and professor, holding forth behind a lectern with death fiddling in accompaniment. Death has the answer to what everyone says and does in the poem, including the poet. You are coming with me, but death doesn't have the last word. Conclusio sums up the book and ends this way. Death's head moth, king of the Tower of Burrs, with streets and avenues written on your wings, I shall come to London and join your dance. I will be one of your things, yet stand not in dread of you. Thy tumble drum nor thy hollow fife, for I know a holy one who someday will shut up thy book with the hands of life. Over the past several months, I have been immersed in Reaney's writing. Some of it has been important to me since I first met it over 40 years ago. Some of it has been new, like the very fascinating Box Social and Other Stories. With some, like Listen to the Wind and Imprecations, The Art of Swearing, I have a new and warmer relationship. I've also been taking heart from the example of Reaney's relentless and generous cultural outreach, his optimism and faith, his relentless commitment to community. They help to keep me going. I do struggle to find the balance he calls for, but where I'm all in, heart and belly and mind, all doubts allayed, is with the Donnellys. I place my entire trust in that masterpiece, with its fully bodied spirit of liveliness and love against narrowness and hatred. The trilogy holds me. Whether I'm reading it silently or living within it, as I did, dreaming it out in the theater, it's the Reaney book of life that shuts up the book of death for me, and that is really what I came here to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stan. I've always enjoyed these lectures because I find so much out, but in this case, I feel overwhelmed a little by what I have discovered. It's been tremendous. Thank you very much. Now, I wanted to, you didn't come out right out and say this, but this book, Southwesto Home, which this edition of Words uses the phrase Southwesto, would not have happened without Stan. I think it's safe to say it was late in my father's life, and he was, by then, probably fairly cryptic in his use of words, but I know I think my editor, Stan Dragland, wishes me to explain white grumphies, white snow. So that's the question from the editor. They are white pigs herded by agricultural students on a snowy day. And you took moments like that and turned them into this wonderful book, and that is the picture of the now demolished farmhouse where my father was born in Perth County. I also want to hold up something that, Stan, you will always be my Mr. December. If you go to the Landon branch, you will see this beautiful poem of Stan's and the Ted Gooden stained glass work that accompanies it. Thank you, and I know we're rushing along, and words will continue to overwhelm us. I think there are brick books waiting outside, and thank you so much, Stan. Another round of applause, please, for Words and Stan.
One more thing.